Please welcome Laila Ibrahim, Chief Operating Officer, DeepMind, Eva Meidel, Member of the European Parliament, and ITRE Rapporteur on the AI Act, and Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you again. You're going to be seeing a lot of me these 2 days. You're all here because you're interested in AI, presumably, so I'm going to start with a public service announcement. As of this morning, there is a new landing page on Bloomberg.com that will give you everything you need every day on the subject of artificial intelligence. It is Bloomberg.com/technology/AI. Very important to put that technology before the AI, as you'll find out if you try to go to Bloomberg.com/AI, but don't go there for the time being. We knew when we began planning this event months ago, Lila and Eva, that AI had to be part of our program, obviously. What we didn't know, of course, was that OpenAI's ChatGPT was going to take the world by storm. And for most people, AI was just an abstraction. They knew that it powered Google search and Alexa, but that was sort of about it, right? Just to get a sense of where we're at, I want a show of hands from the audience. How many of you right here, right now, have tried either ChatGPT or Google's Bard? Put up your hands. Not bad, huh? I'm not going to ask those of you who haven't tried it to put up your hands. And who here has started working with either of those as a productivity tool, incorporating them into your own workflow or those of your employees? Show of hands, please. Also, impressive. Ladies, I want the audience to understand the story behind your views on artificial intelligence, because neither of you began life, at least as an adult, right, as a data scientist. You're an engineer, Lila.
Yes.
And you studied business. Tell us a bit about how you got here, Eva.
Well, lately, the European Parliament and the European institutions are all about various acts and, regulatory enforcements and so on. So that's why I guess I am here in a way, because we've been viewed from everyone across the world as the place of regulation. Not so much of innovation, I have to be brutally honest, though. But as we're approaching the final days of the work on the AI Act, I have to say that I'm very happy to be working on it, because it's my second term as a member of the European Parliament, and I have worked on all the big tech files that we have had, and always tried to balance between enabling companies to develop in Europe, but also in the same time trying to put some sort of a regulatory environment that could protect citizens or give more predictability for businesses, or make Europe more attractive for businesses, because I'm also one of the rapporteurs of the CHIPS Act, the European CHIPS Act, which negotiations concluded yesterday afternoon in the European Parliament. And I see the CHIPS Act, for example, as a legislation that is a little bit more strategic compared to previous legislations like the DSA, the DMA. Many of you have heard of those that have a pure regulatory focus.
Lila, you spent a good part of your career in the semiconductor industry. You've been in software. You've been in venture capital. Why AI?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I was 30 years. I'm 30 years into my career right now, and I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have spent earlier parts of my career bringing new technologies into new markets and to new segments. And I, as you said, I've had a pretty circuitous career. And I decided after some period of time, I kind of need a break. And someone said, you really need to talk to this company. And I said, oh, yeah, not quite yet. And they're like, no, it's based in London. I'm like, oh, I'm in California. I know it was wintertime. I'm like, yeah, definitely not. But I was, and they're like, oh, they're working in AI. And I said, well, I don't know. I know a lot about technology and new markets. But I did it as a favor to a mentor, and it turned out to be a life-changing conversation. But I kept trying to get out of the job. And I thought, if I want to do AI, I can stay in Silicon Valley. Why would I want to work on AI if I've not done this before? And so I was asking a lot of questions during the interview process. In fact, I spent 50 hours interviewing the company to make sure this was the field I wanted to go into in the last part of my career. This was the role as chief operating officer, and this was the company. And what really happened was I realized that AI was the intersection of technology and social impact. And this was an organization with high integrity. And the more I interviewed the company to see if this is really what I wanted to do, I'd go home and I'd tuck my twin daughters into bed saying, what kind of world are they going to live in? And can I bring my experience of technology and social impact to make DeepMind's approach better, faster? Because the organization that's going to develop more generalized AI first should be the one who I feel like from an integrity perspective can do it. And I often describe it as a moral calling. And that is how I ended up at DeepMind and being the person on the executive staff who brought in a different perspective.
Now that we know a little bit about the mindsets with which you approach this subject, I want to hammer away at both of you and cover a lot of ground over the course of this panel. There is an extraordinary amount of attention around AI and specifically generative AI technology, that underlying ChatGPT, Bard, and others like Stable Diffusion. Help us level set. It's important. Is the exuberance justified? And what about the fears? Lila.
I think it's a very exciting time in AI. Generative AI is something I think has really shifted the conversation because it's just as we saw by the show of hands here, it's made everyone's interactions with AI slightly differently. We've been fortunate to have been working on this for a while, so are aware of the capabilities and potential. The area that I'm particularly excited about actually has less to do with generative AI and really about where AI can help advance science and benefit humanity in some of the most challenging problems of our time, such as the environment and climate crisis. We're already using AI systems to do things like make existing infrastructure, optimize existing infrastructure. So we've worked with our counterparts at Google to optimize data centers and saving up to 30–40% of energy savings. We've been able to use AI as a tool to develop better prediction models. The Met Office in the UK actually, out of 50, we had 50 meteorologists actually wanting to use the DeepMind AI system for the prediction, and this could be critical in times of extreme climate shifts. And then finally, we're using advanced AI systems to uncover new solutions to problems that we don't fully understand or that we think may never be achievable. We've worked to and use AI to help control the plasma of nuclear fusion reactors, which is an important step in the safety of making this a viable solution. So I think there's a lot of things that we're seeing, and generative AI in my mind is really just the first rung on a very long ladder. I think it's exciting to think about the potential, and again, the reason I joined DeepMind was thinking about what future I want to hand my children and the generations that follow, and I believe AI can help us create a better society.
Eva, you have a constructive view on the role of business and technology in the economy and in society. So how do you balance the two, particularly as someone who is drafting regulation, the exuberance on the one side, and as I said, the fear on the other?
Well, it's a fine balance, and it's a very difficult balance. First and foremost, because the European law on AI was presented by the Commission more than a year ago. Mm-hmm. So the work just in the European Parliament has been ongoing before the whole hype around ChatGPT. And it has not taken into consideration those foundational models. So right now, we've already had a difficult discussion into making sure how we legislate, not just from a civil liberties perspective, not just from the perspective of privacy and protection of our citizens, but also the perception of helping companies, particularly in Europe, innovate, grow, flourish, and develop some of those tools that would help society become better. Over the past couple of months, the conversation has shifted, meaning we would need to address those foundational models as well. So there's a number of things of how to make that balance right. And I don't think it's just up to the new legislation. First and foremost, we need to look already at existing laws, such as GDPR and others, and see where regulatory bodies are enforcing them well, whether they are implementing the law at all, and where they are acting at the time, and create a coordination among them. So the same set of rules applies all across countries and jurisdictions which abide by those rules. The second thing is to make sure that this, horizontal law that we are working in, it will affect all fields in society is done wisely. There has been a lot of discussion around what consists of high-risk AI to make sure we very well discuss and label what is low-risk AI, what should be banned, what is high-risk AI, and how those are decided, because depending on which category a company falls into, you're going to abide by more rules or less rules. And finally, I think it's complementing this too. And finally, it's about political leaders trying to understand this disruption that's happening in society and how it will change society.
So in that context, I have to ask you both about the letter. And the letter I'm talking about is the one that was signed about 3 weeks ago by more than 1,100 technologists and industry leaders in AI, calling for a 6-month pause on development to allow for more safety controls. And of course, it caused a stir. I suspect many of you are familiar with it. It described, and I'm going to quote directly from the letter, an out-of-control race to develop and deploy ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. Is that an accurate description of what's going on?
I think Lila can tell better if that's an accurate description, but from where I'm sitting, the way I see things is that this letter and the various calls that we have heard and read over the past couple of weeks in particular have to trigger the conversation, the societal conversation. And in that societal conversation, policymakers, political leaders, the business that works, many of the people that represent different stakeholders and parts of society who've signed that letter have to be part of that conversation. Because ultimately, and I have said that in the past, if you want society to embrace technology and to trust technology, you need to have that social contract with society. And if it's necessary to put more guardrails, to put certain mechanisms and principles in place, and this is what we want to do in the AI Act, you need some sort of clear principles and mechanisms, not just to regulate the next big thing that is coming, but that will be foundational for the technology under which whatever you want to create that has to do something with AI, you need to abide by those basic principles and mechanisms. So if we do that, it would be very helpful for whoever wants to work on AI to know that these are the safety things you need to take care of. And I think if more rules are necessary, which the letter calls, they need to be discussed. It will not help to ban it in one country or another country, because it would still be developing and operational in a third country or a fourth country or a nation or a continent. So it's a very complex conversation, and my worry is that it's not necessarily taking place in the way I just described.
So, Lila, is your industry out of control?
Well, I don't quite see it that way. I do think the essence of the letter, which calls for responsibility and safety, is a good one, and one that we agree with at DeepMind. I also, with what you've just said about the importance of how do we bring parties together across sectors, across geographic boundaries. Within DeepMind, as I said, I've spent the past 5 years really, you can have a set of AI principles to put them into practice and do it in a way where it's part of the DNA of an organization. It's hard work. It takes effort, and it takes leadership time and commitment and dedication and accountability to do that. And you can't have conversations externally without having this inside your own organization. And so, even since DeepMind's founding, we've had a set of AI principles since 2010, which really became the cornerstone of, I think, what a lot of other companies are doing. So I feel that the responsibility needs to start with conversations in the organization. It needs to be operationalized. It needs to be touching all aspects of the development. Then you can think about the deployment, like responsible development, deployment. And I think what's happening is a lot of times we think about the deployment and then responsibility becomes like a bolt-on rather than truly integrated. And then we need to be able to have the communication and the conversations. What I'm excited about right now that's happening in our industry is that, again, show of hands, that we can have these conversations. More people are interested in coming to have the seat around the table. Different stakeholders from private sector, from companies outside the AI sector, from government, from civil society. And I think it's part of the reason that we're here today is because we want to raise the visibility of these conversations and the need for us all to be working together.
What about this idea of a pause on development? The arguments in favor are safety, of course, job security for people whose livelihoods may be threatened, and, at the end of the day, even the viability of the human race. And the arguments against are noncompliance, right? Nobody's going to honor an agreement like that. Enforcement is basically impossible. And by way of example, the geographical point that you raised, China and Russia just don't care. They're going to speed ahead while the West stands still, and so we can't afford to stop. Where do you stand?
Well, maybe just a question. It might sound a little bit too political, but a lot of the people calling for a stop of the development are continuing to go ahead with that development. So if they
might you be thinking about Elon Musk?
For example, but not only, probably. So I just think that...
you think it's hypocritical?
I just think that, one way to put a ban is from a regulatory perspective to say we will put a ban. But again, you won't put a ban everywhere, right? So it would still continue to develop. And another thing is for companies to sit together, because we're speaking about a handful of companies at the moment, at least the ones that are creating the hype, to decide to maybe slow down and take a step back. From the point of view where I see things and what politicians can do is have the conversation with society. Do we really need this at the speed it is developing now? This is one question that why would we want this developing in this particular way? What are the perils? What are the possibilities? The speed is unprecedented. And it's very difficult for society to be able to grasp the speed with which things are moving. We earlier in the breakout session talked a little bit about jobs. I've been hearing that jobs will be lost for about 10 years now. I'm not necessarily seeing it, and I think the conversation now has shifted to other societal concerns that are much broader and are much bigger, and we need to be able to assess those. It's even a philosophical discussion, and it's a very hard discussion, and this is why I think from a political perspective, it's not easy to have it, and it might not happen until a more major, one could call it a catastrophic event, doesn't happen to trigger that conversation. But ideally, it should happen earlier.
Lila, has the Pandora's box that Sam Altman opened by releasing ChatGPT to the public changed life inside DeepMind? Is there now an inexorable tug toward allocating resources for large language models and generative AI in a way there wasn't before?
DeepMind's been in existence since 2010. It's a long time. We've been working on generative AI models for several years. In fact, even a few years ago when we released our first technical paper, we held off on releasing the technical paper until we had done an ethics assessment and realizing that there wasn't even a taxonomy about how to talk about risk. So we held back a technical paper until we did this together. So I would say generative AI is part of DeepMind's portfolio, but it's not the only thing. Our mission is really to advance science to benefit humanity. And we've been working, it's more of a long-term mission. It's why things like AlphaFold on protein folding or the work around climate are areas where we're investing. So we have a slightly different approach to a lot of this. Has it shifted how we operate? I would say the conversation, we've been very internally focused. It's shifted the conversation now. Everybody wants to understand a little bit more about AI, understand potential implications, near-term, long-term, bias, inclusion, implications on labor market, et cetera. So I think what's exciting is for us to be able to say, okay, well, we come as knowledge experts on AI, but there's so much we don't even know. Even when we were developing our AlphaFold system, we brought in biologists because we said, okay, we know what AI can do to solve this 50-year-old problem in biology about understanding life and disease and all these other things, but what implications does this have on the biology community? So what's happened now is we've shifted of being internally focused to say, okay, we can bring this, we can share our knowledge, but regulators, please, how can we help you understand this? How is it best to regulate? The creative community. Let's explain a little bit more about what generative AI is and isn't. Tell us a little bit more about how you might be able to use this. What are you worried about? So we can build that into how we do our research.
People know, though, that at the very least they're aware that DeepMind is part of Google, and they wonder, and I wonder, whether because of the phenomenon that generative AI has become in only a matter of weeks, really, whether Sundar, the CEO, or Ruth, the CFO, is saying, you folks at DeepMind, I need you to be working on this now.
DeepMind has operated as an autonomous organization. We joined forces with Google in 2014. And the founders made the decision at that time that in order to accelerate progress towards the mission of advancing science to benefit humanity, it really required additional resources and a commitment to the long term versus the short term quarter. And that was something that was very well aligned with Google. And I would say we've had amazing support from Alphabet and collaborate a lot with our counterparts across the organization. Having spent the first 18 years of my career inside of Intel and inside of a corporate environment, I'm I understand a corporate environment, and I would say that it's a healthy relationship. And I actually think that you look at it's two of the world's leading labs in AI that have really enabled some of the technology to get to where it's at, and trying to approach this next stage of how can we continue to be bold while also being responsible.
Eva, you referred earlier not so obliquely to Elon Musk. And as you're probably aware, he confirmed in an interview a couple of days ago that he plans to create what he calls a third option, which is to say a third option to Microsoft/OpenAI and Google in artificial intelligence. Given what he's accomplished in other industries, obviously the automotive industry, space travel, satellite communications, should we welcome a third option in the form of Elon? Is it a good thing that he's out there buying up NVIDIA chips and trying to poach talent from companies like DeepMind? So there's more competition.
Well, as we have seen, it takes quite a while to develop those models, and you need different things. You just don't need a great idea. I think, would there be a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth option? It's to be seen. There are European AI companies working on that at the moment as well. So competition is, of course, a good thing. Healthy competition competition is necessary. And I think what is important from here onwards is also for regulators to see how rules are enforced, but also whether those rules have to be better adapted to the digital and technological era we are living in. When we speak about data, for example, and the way companies are being acquired or merged and so on and so forth. I think our role is to make sure that those rules are there, and we implement them, and we create the right market conditions, speaking for Europe, of course. But on the other hand, for us, we need to see how this thing will develop in the long run. It's not just about seeing the forest, it's also about seeing the trees. It's something that we need to tackle some things today, but there are a number of things in the long run need to be tackled. And what I worry is that we do not see these things in the next 5, 7, 10 years from now, and the implications on the way democracy works, on the way our education system works, on the way we take decisions as policymakers. So I think we need to understand that it's not business as usual for policymakers, and it's not just by creating one law that you're going to solve it all. It's a much more complex environment, and we to take a different set of skills, a different approach to policy making and decision taking, and overall a different type of leadership, I would say, from the public sector.
Can I maybe add something onto that, building off of your point? So I've spent the majority of my career in Silicon Valley, and it's really interesting to think about the differences of having building an organization that's headquartered in tech capital, Silicon Valley, versus building it with more of a European-centric view, which I think London and the diversity of ethnicities and skill sets that we're able to bring, not just computer scientists, but neuroscientists, social scientists, anthropologists, et cetera, around the table into the organization. I feel, after 30 years in tech, like building an organization here is quite different. The history, the culture, the multinational perspective, the way that you approach conversations like how might this impact the job market, not just jobs being tech sector, but more broadly, how does it impact the arts? How does it impact the neighboring countries? It's a very different approach. And I think that actually you talked about another way. I think actually this is quite exceptional. And so I would, organizations that are headquartered here, which I would expect much of the audience is like, there is an advantage and a different path that I think everyone is charting out. And I think that's quite exciting. And sometimes we kind of lose that perspective of really the values that we can bring into the work that we do every day that impacts the rest of the world.
Lila, I love a note of optimism, and I think given that we're here in Ireland and this is the Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Europe, that is a very appropriate place on which to end our conversation. Mm-hmm. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Eva Maydell and Lila Ibrahim.
Welcome Rachel Everard, Head of Sustainability Rolls-Royce, Val Miftakov, Founder and Chief Executive Officer Zero Avia, Rachel Moncrief, Deputy Director, the International Council on Clean Transportation, Willie Walsh, Director General, the International Air Transport Association, and Bloomberg's John Fraher.
Thank you, everyone. So from AI to the future of aviation. Well, the future of aviation has never looked more exciting. It seems like every time you look at we read the news, we read about new exciting technologies that are going to take us where we want to go faster and cleaner than ever. hydrogen, electric planes, air taxis, sustainable aviation fuel. But at the same time, there's a dark shadow looming over all of this. Aviation accounts for 2.5% of global emissions, and whether we like it or not, we're all part of that problem. Aviation is sort of hardwired into the global economy. So solving this is obviously one of the most crucial challenges facing the world and facing the industry. We're on the way to doing it for ground transport, for EVs, but how do we do that for planes? Exciting technologies exist, but as a recent report said, the cost of decarbonizing the aviation industry could be as high as 820 billion euros. So there's a lot to do, a lot to get into. Willie, let me start with you. Well, firstly, your old sparring partner, Michael O'Leary, had the audience in stitches earlier. Do you have any good jokes?
Well, Michael and I get on very well, but we shared a panel once when we were asked to explain why there were so many Irish people involved in aviation. And of course, I gave the very diplomatic response about the history of aircraft leasing and how that really has led to people being involved. And he turned around, he said, no. He said, hang on a second. He said, it's very simple. He said, airlines are full of liars, bullshitters and drunks. And he said, in Ireland, we excel at all three.
Well, let's run with that in this panel, shall we?
I won't tell you which one I am and which one he is.
But before we get into that and all of these technologies and the question of decarbonisation, I mean, obviously you're an industry veteran. Can you just give us like a very, very, very quick sort of your view on where the aviation industry is now coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, we're doing well at the moment. The recovery is strong and is continuing. I think there are some positives there. The reopening of China came as a surprise. We weren't expecting that to happen until later on this year. If I look at it in February, we're at about globally 85% of where we were in 2019. Domestic markets have effectively fully recovered. Some are above where they were in 2019, some slightly below. International aviation is at about 78% of where it was in 2019. But that will recover now with the opening of China and the relaxation of restrictions in Asia. If I look at it, international travel within Asia last year was at 22% of where it was in 2019. So there's still a long way to go to fully recover. But the airline industry globally is expected to make a small profit this year, very small, just under 5 billion collectively, predominantly because of the strong performance in the US, and that's really the US domestic market. But we are going in the right direction.
Good. Thank you for that. So let's get into it. Let's get into decarbonisation. Can you sort of lay the table, I guess, for this conversation? What is the best case scenario for how we decarbonise aviation over the next 30 years? Planes are heavy. They need a lot of energy and power to get off the ground. I think there's a forecast that the number of passengers in the world is going to more than double between now and 2040.
Yeah, but I think there's a big disconnect between the number of passengers and the CO2 from the industry, and that's been going on for some time. Like, if I look back to between 2000 and 2019, so ignoring the period of the crisis, so between 2000 and 2019, passenger numbers were 2.7 times. CO2 was 1.5. So we have seen a disconnect between passenger growth and CO2 growth. Now, that's not to say CO2 won't continue to grow at a gross level. It will. The positive, however, is that the industry is absolutely determined to achieve net zero in 2050. We had previously set a target of a 50% reduction in net emissions by 2050, but we recognise that we were now out of line with the science and out of line with the government and political thinking. So at our AGM 2 years ago, we committed to net zero in 2050, and we put forward a pathway to achieving that. Now, I say A because we recognise that there will be multiple options and things will develop over time. But the predominant contribution will come from sustainable aviation fuel, which, based on the pathway that we identified, would account for about 65% of the abatement in 2050. Technology will contribute. We will, at that stage, based on what we're currently seeing, still have a requirement for some offsetting, but most of it will come through the form of sustainable aviation fuel. And some of the offsetting, by the way, will be, we define carbon capture as offsetting. So it's not the offsetting as we've known it historically. So we believe we can get there. It is going to be expensive, you're quite right. We're continuing to estimate the cost of various different options, but it will likely be in excess of $1 trillion US dollars, and that will have to be borne by consumers. There's just no way around that. If I look at the industry, the best 10 years in our history, 2010 to 2019, the industry made an operating profit or an operating margin of 5.4%. And that was with fuel. Brent was at $80 a barrel, jet was at $93.60 a barrel. So fuel represented 27% of the cost base. Today, sustainable aviation fuel is more than twice the price of traditional kerosene. Mm-hmm. So there is no way this industry, given the tiny margins that we operate with, can absorb the additional cost that's coming down the track. So ultimately, you will see higher energy prices reflected in higher ticket prices, which clearly will have an impact on demand going forward.
Do you have a best guess on how much an average plane ticket, let's say London to New York, would cost in 10 years, 20 years' time?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say at this stage. The one thing I would say is that our industry has been able to cope with price volatility in oil. Back in 2008, oil prices in June, July 2008 were $150 a barrel. In January 2009, they were $40 a barrel. So that volatility is something the industry can cope with. What we see, though, is that going forward, sustainable fuels, or whatever way you look at it, e-fuels, will be more expensive than traditional kerosene, which will increase the cost base, and the cost base will have to be reflected in higher ticket prices. But difficult at this stage to quantify that in terms of the impact on average ticket prices.
I'll get back to you later on sustainable aviation fuel and whether there's enough land on the planet to actually make all of that fuel. But we'll get back to that in a moment. I want to bring in Rachel here. Your organization, you look very closely at government policy around the world. And again, making the parallel with electric vehicles, one of the big reasons why we're seeing this huge shift towards electric cars is because of government intervention. It is because of the rules and laws about phasing out the internal combustion engine over the next 20, 30 years. Can you sort of give us sort of a global overview on where you see global aviation policy right now in terms of encouraging, pushing, forcing the aviation industry to make these changes?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And just to give you just a little bit of background, I work for a nonprofit, and as a lot of nonprofits, we are mission-driven, and our mission is really to reduce the carbon emissions from global transportation in line with what is required by the Paris commitments. And I always, I'm at these talking about climate change all the time. It can get a little depressing. So I always want to start off with a little bit of a positive. We know how to do it. It's ambitious, but it is feasible, and we can already see it happening, like you mentioned, in the on-road sector. The targets that the EU just recently finalized in terms of not allowing the sale of internal combustion engines for cars after 2035. The new proposal, actually, that the UK just put out is even a little bit stronger than that, which is nice. US is having a complementary proposal. Those are actually kind of in line with what we need to stay below 2 degrees. Last year, we did a study on aviation, and we also looked at how we can keep the aviation sector below 2 degrees. And Willie mentioned a lot of the same findings that we had. It's going to be a lot about sustainable aviation fuel. It's going to be about improved efficiencies, and it's going to be about zero emission planes, which I think we're going to hear a little bit more about shortly. And the exciting part for us is that we have identified a pathway that is feasible. Now we are going to need government regulations, and I think it's kind of interesting. You look at what's taking place in Europe, and you look at what's taking place in the U.S., and they're kind of going on two different pathways. Let's start with the U.S. We've heard a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is really about incentives and subsidies to bring the sustainable aviation fuel using government money, and that's going to probably get us displacing about 10% of our aviation fuel by about 2030, something along those lines. That is using government money. The EU is taking a different approach. They're actually putting in place a proposal to put in place blending mandates. So that means the airlines themselves the fuel suppliers and the airlines themselves are responsible for using ever-increasing amounts of sustainable aviation fuels. I think both types of policies are great examples. I would say the mandates are really the thing that is going to make the this sort of polluter pay principle. We don't all fly with governments doing massive subsidies. Those are great. When you have mandates, they're being taken up by the people who are actually flying. We talked about ticket prices. We have an estimate on average 22% increase in a ticket price, something along the lines by 2050.
By what? By 2050?
Yeah. So, we believe strongly that, government has a strong role to play here. The other thing is I've talked about US, I've talked about Europe. China and India is where like the massive, massive growth is happening in the aviation sector. They're still working on their plans. They don't quite have the pathway that they've identified yet. So we'll be looking to support them on that.
Okay. Well, we've talked about how depressing climate can be. But, we like at Bloomberg Green, we like to write a lot about the exciting technologies that are going to decarbonize our economy. Valerie, I'd like to talk to you. You're the CEO of Zero Avia, which is all about hydrogen electric propulsion. Before I ask you the skeptical question about hydrogen and get into it, do you want to tell the audience just a little bit about what your technology does and what your company does?
Sure. So I'm founder, CEO of Zero Avia. We're about 5.5 years old. We built new generation of engines for future of aviation, all sizes of aircraft eventually. We're flying already several prototypes out of about 200 miles from here in the Cotswolds. We have our flight test base in the UK, and we're flying now 20-seat aircraft with our fuel cell engines. So there's a full-size commercial aircraft, small, but commercial use, and full-size engine. We're looking to deploy this in market in 2025, so 2.5 years out. Already working with the certification agencies across the world, CAA, FAA, EASA. On your earlier point about the sort of depressing dark shadow, actually, the situation is both worse and better than you described. The carbon emissions alone is 2.7%, but for aviation, majority of the impact is actually not in carbon. Majority of the impact is from the non-carbon artifacts of combustion. And while the error bars on those estimates are still large, we just had the session at Jet Zero Council over in Farnborough just 2 days ago, I think, or maybe yesterday. Time is a little bit. And the situation is that if you continue combust fuel at high altitudes, you're still going to have all of those non-CO2 effects. And then if you take a metric of, for example, dollars spent per climate abatement, anything combustion-related, especially more expensive combustion-related technologies, are not going to make it with respect to non-combustion technologies. And that was the thinking when we started thinking about the technology basis for Zero Avia and going after larger commercial aircraft. It was clear to us that we have to get away from combustion, which means that we have to electrify this transport. But the batteries would just not have enough energy, not enough energy in the weight allowance that you have in the aircraft. So we need to get electricity from something better. And that better substance is hydrogen. It's actually 3 times better on the energy content per unit of weight than even kerosene, even the jet fuel. And then the fuel cells convert that energy into electricity much more efficiently, or energy into propulsion much more efficiently than any combustion engine. So you have fuel that's better objectively, and you're converting it to propulsion more efficiently, and you're avoiding all the climate effects, right? Non-combustion system avoids all the non-carbon effects. You obviously avoid all carbon if the hydrogen comes from zero-emission sources. So all of that means that you have hydrogen electric as fundamentally, from first principles, the best solution. And it's only a matter of time until we have that transition. While we have that transition to all sides of the vehicles over the next 20, 30 years, SAF, whether synthetic or bio, is a transition fuel. That's our opinion. The transition fuel that powers the aircraft of larger sizes throughout that transition. So it's a multi-decade opportunity there, but eventually it will go just like the whole automotive market is moving towards electric cars now, will move towards zero-emission propulsion.
But so much of the emissions from the airline industry come from long-haul flight, right? This is not going to be a solution for that.
Why not?
Right.
Why not? It can be. So again, in aviation, what matters the most is weight. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, by the way, why we think that for batteries it will be very, very hard situation to power any significant size aircraft, because you get into this sort of rocket equation type problem, right? When you need more battery to carry a battery, right? And you kind of exponentially run out of room. So the main problem in aviation is weight. And by weight, hydrogen is, again, 3 times better energy content than jet fuel. Once you take into account the higher efficiency of the hydrogen electric propulsion, fuel cells, electric motors, you're actually 4 to 5 times better on the per unit of weight than jet fuel. So even with the extra weights that you have to put in the fuel storage system, you're still significantly better than jet fuel. So on mass, you're better. You need more volume to store the fuel to go transatlantic or trans-Pacific. But the volume is much less of a problem for aircraft designed for aviation than weight. So, Airbus has announced part of their ZRE program. They announced the wing body design that they want to bring to market. That design has 3 to 4 times more space for fuel than traditional sort of wing and tube design. So that's the type of designs that we're going to see. And on the time order of this 2-3 decades, this is entirely possible. So what I see happening a lot in these discussions is that classic example of people underestimate what can happen in 20, 30 years, right, decades, and overestimate what can happen in a year, right? And as a result, we're myopic to these major transitions that are powered by these first principles, physics, chemistry, fundamentals, right? And the same thing happened in automotive, just on batteries, right? And yes, the initial introduction was fueled by the government mandates and government subsidies, but now for a lot of commercial applications, electric cars are actually better economically than combustion cars. It's just operating cost and amortized acquisition costs are better for taxis and for a lot of other applications. Same thing's going to happen here.
I'm going to bring in Rachel in a moment, but Willie, how plausible does that sound to you?
I think the issue we have is looking at 2050 as the absolute deadline of achieving net zero. And while I fully accept what is being said, today 75 to 80% of CO2 produced by the industry is from flights of greater than 1,500 kilometers. So I fully accept that beyond probably 2040 and certainly beyond 2050, hydrogen becomes much more of a factor. But what we've been looking at is how do we get to net zero in 2050, because that's the critical deadline. As it is today, it'll probably change. That 2050 may even be brought forward, and we know that there are some countries who have greater ambition than that. So, it will require for us to fully exploit technology like hydrogen. It will require new aircraft design. The advantage of sustainable aviation fuel is because it's what we call a drop-in fuel. It can be used on the aircraft that are in service today and the aircraft that will be delivered over the next 10 years, which will continue to be in service probably out to 2050. And it also uses the existing infrastructure at airports. So, it's definitely one of the ways that we will use to reduce to net zero. But clearly for us, out to 2050, sustainable aviation fuel is the most important.
And a best guess for you when we will see a commercially viable hydrogen plane?
Well, Airbus are talking about 2035 for the introduction. So if you assume it's introduced in 2035, and they seem to be pretty confident around that, but for that to have any real impact, it will be beyond 2050.
Right. Rachel Everett, I want to bring you in. You're Chief Sustainability Officer at Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce, of course, are on the front end of all of this. Do you want to give us sort of an overview of where the most interesting and exciting developments are in terms of taking the jet engine that we have now and making it cleaner, and also developing different kinds of engines?
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually agree absolutely with a lot of what's been said across the panel. So Rolls-Royce, when we look at our net zero transition strategy, I really think about it as having kind of 4 pillars. And when we spoke earlier, I mentioned 3, but I'm going to add a 4th. So firstly is making the most efficient engines that we have to date even more efficient. So what you travel on transatlantic, how we can squeeze out every single drop of improved fuel burn, therefore improved efficiency, maximize that potential. Slightly higher kind of fans, more air coming through the engine, squeezing it up, really being able to generate maximum thrust. And I think what's really great about that is you don't have to change the infrastructure. What we have today, all the embedded carbon that's within our aviation infrastructure remains. It has a role to play. Then the drop-in fuels, the SAFs, the sustainable aviation fuels, whether they're from kind of bio or waste generated or whether they're ultimately e-fuels, synthetically produced, those are available today. They can be used on our engines that are in service today without any need to change anything, which I think is a fantastic interim solution, delivering up to around a 70 to 80% life cycle CO2 saving, so pretty substantial. Today, regulation only allows us to use about a 50-50% blend. We've proven across our portfolio that our engines are ready to go on 100% with no changes. And then thirdly, the kind of exciting end of the market, the disruptive technologies, fully electric, hydrogen. I think those all have a role to play, and it's across, depends kind of how far you want to go, how many people you're trying to move, or how many goods you're trying to move. And all of those different solutions all play a role just depending on how you scale up or down that curve. And then my fourth pillar that I didn't mention earlier, but I think it's around that enabling environment. What's the landscape that the aviation industry needs in order to be successful? So whether it's the policies that we've talked about, it's also around people's acceptance of these technologies. You mentioned some of the kind of triangle-shaped wide wing planes. People also have to choose whether or not they will get on them. And I think that's a really important point that we can't underestimate as well, is how we collectively as an entire system have to adapt. Because that's the thing with aviation. We talked about kind of reglobalization, I think, right this morning. We are such a global industry, and you are always taking off in one location, almost always taking off in one location and landing in another. So you need to have that infrastructure on the ground ready to go. So you can either refuel your plane, your hydrogen fuel cell, you can recharge your battery, or you can put in your SAF, and that has to happen kind of unanimously across the sector. We can't have kind of isolated technologies coming to fruition at different timescales, and I think that's what's very kind of unique sometimes about aviation. But from Rolls-Royce's perspective, yeah, we've got a number of really exciting technology projects. We broke the world speed record last year with an all-electric plane, single-seater, but it's the world's most powerful battery ever taken to the sky, so really proving the potential of some of that technology. We are working on some hydrogen projects as well, which I won't go into in too much detail, but again, we've tested a gaseous hydrogen engine actually. Again, operated as expected, no real changes needed, which is pretty key in an industry that's so heavily regulated and relies so much on certification. No changes, sometimes a really, really good thing. And then we're doing, as I said, a huge amount on SAF and on our new engine technologies, a program we called UltraFan, which is bringing about whole new levels of kind of composite materials in our engines, really big new fan blades, really increasing that bypass ratio, really maximizing what we know today.
I mean, we've heard a lot about SAF already on this panel, and I'd like to dig into that a little more. I mean, Rachel Moncrief, I mean, what do you say to this again, the question I sort of alluded to earlier, like there just isn't, is there enough acreage and land on the planet to actually make all of the sustainable aviation fuel?
Yeah,
I mean, if it's going to be, I think 65%, Willie, was the number that you guys are looking at.
Yeah, and I mean,
how are we going to make all of that?
Just to clarify, there's sort of, and we've sort of brought it up a couple times, but just to make sure everyone's clear, there's sort of two different buckets of sustainable aviation fuels. There's the kind made from biomass, and then there's the kind made from renewable energy, right? And so right now, all of the SAFs that are available are the kind made from biomass. So over time, you're going to see that transition, and we're going to move towards the kind made from renewable energy. I don't think we do have a limit on biomass, especially the really low carbon biomass. You know, not all biomass is created equal. So if you are using something as a food-based biomass, that's not really good for the environment, to be honest. We need, the more like sort of the second generation biomass and that sort of thing. And then over time, once we have a lot more green electrons, other sectors working in parallel to get those, we're going to be able to switch towards these sort of the e-kerosene and this kind of thing made from renewable electricity. And I will just also add a plug in, because these kind of sustainable fuels are so much needed in the aviation sector. We cannot use them in the on-road sector. We just don't have there's not enough of them. And these sectors are fighting for there's a very limited quantity of fuels. We already have solutions. in the on-road sector. And so this is one of the reasons that my organization, every time we hear about, fuel-based like e-fuel or biofuel solutions for the on-road sector, we're like, no. We need to be putting those into aviation where they're more needed.
I'm sorry, for the uninitiated in the audience, can you explain very e-kerosene, what exactly, how is that made, where does that come from?
Yeah, you basically take carbon dioxide out of the air, and you use electricity and you convert it into essentially a drop-in fuel that's basically the equivalent of kerosene. If you looked at it, you wouldn't know. And then when you burn it, over the whole life cycle, it's a carbon-neutral fuel.
Yeah.
And today, the e-fuels, which are technically possible but very expensive, and the critical issue is you have to get renewable energy because you're using, electrolysis break down water to produce hydrogen to combine it with CO2. So, the raw materials are available, but the energy required is very high today, and therefore it's also very expensive. But the projected price for e-fuels, your organization did a great paper on this. If you go out to 2050, I think a projected average price for a gallon of e-fuel at just over $4 a gallon. Average of a gallon of kerosene the first 3 months of this year was about $2.80. So you can see it's more expensive. But not way more expensive, that it's beyond the capability of the industry to address this. So there definitely are solutions there. What we need to see from an airline point of view, and this goes very much to what Rachel said earlier, was the difference in approach between the US, which is very much the carrot, incentivizing production, and in the EU, the stick. Now, I don't believe that we need to show any demand signals, because the industry has said we are going to hit net zero in 2050, and we're going to do that largely through sustainable fuels. So we want to see greater production. The US is definitely going to incentivize production through the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides at a federal level up to $1.75 per gallon if it can be at 100% reduction, $1.25 at 50% reduction. So there's definitely going to be quite a lot of investment in the US. So I've absolutely no doubt that the US will achieve its goals in terms of sustainable aviation fuel. I'm more concerned about Europe, where today, we're being forced to blend fuel. If you look at France, for example, they've mandated a 2% blend.
By the 2024?
Well, they're saying today.
So, yeah.
And it isn't there.
Yeah.
And if it isn't there, you pay a fine. But, incentivizing somebody to produce something is very different to forcing somebody to buy something that isn't there. Yeah. So I think getting the right policy frameworks in place is important. And I'm not saying they have to be exactly the same, but I think there is scope for a greater push within Europe and the UK to incentivize the production of sustainable aviation fuels.
Valerie wants to get in, but very quick follow-up. We've touched very briefly earlier on India and China. India and China is a huge part of the future of aviation, obviously. Are you seeing, how would you rate the attempts by the airlines in those countries to get to net zero?
Yeah, everybody wants to get to net zero in 2050. I think some are more confident about how they can get there because they've already modeled the cost impact and they see it, within their ability to get there. Others are much more concerned. Yeah. But at an industry level, I'm very confident that we will achieve it.
Valerie, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick point. One thing that gets lost sometimes in these discussions is that, as Rachel mentioned, right, the scalable part of the SAF is really synthetic, right? Synthetic production from hydrogen and carbon capture and all of that, right? So in some ways, the only way we're going to move aviation to zero climate impact, zero emission is through hydrogen, right? Because you need hydrogen for synthetic SAF production. You need hydrogen for what we do. You need hydrogen for what Rolls-Royce does with the combustion, okay? And that's the only way you're going to get enough zero emission energy, renewable energy, on board the aircraft. There is no other way. Not going to happen, okay? So when we talk to people in the hydrogen space, right, so like hydrogen councils of the world and all that, we present this opportunity, and it's really an opportunity for a hydrogen industry to have this protected space where, as already mentioned, there are other sectors where some other solutions will work, right? So batteries for trucks, batteries for cars, but for aviation, all roads take us to hydrogen, right? And that's an important bit to think about, and specifically green hydrogen, right? So the electrolysis capacity needs to grow up, and all of these technologies around that as well. So just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I came into this panel hoping to sort of bring some skepticism to the hydrogen story, but clearly I'm failing.
I think there has to be skepticism, though, because there is no hydrogen infrastructure today.
Right.
And that is part of the challenge,
Yes.
right? And as you say, everyone is talking about hydrogen as this silver bullet solution, and it largely is, but there isn't enough green hydrogen in the world. Everyone is wanting green hydrogen. So there has to be this massive scale-up of availability of green hydrogen, as well as fuels like SAFs, as a shorter-term solution. I think that's part of this skepticism has to exist.
And from where you said, I mean, I have a whole panel on this tomorrow, so people can come and listen to that as well. But if you look at the policy incentives, I mean, Willie was talking about the policy incentives from the EU versus the US in terms of the hydrogen that we need. Are you more encouraged by what we're hearing from Brussels or what we're hearing from Washington, or neither of them?
I think, as we said, it's carrot and stick, right? Two different approaches. I think we're relatively agnostic as long as we continue to get the investment we need into R&D. Aviation is a very important but also very expensive industry to decarbonize. So the more that we can support those R&D programs, the better.
Yeah. So just a sort of final question, really, and Willie, I'll start with you, but very keen to sort of hear what everyone else has to say. I mean, from what we're hearing here, this is going to be incredibly expensive. Mm-hmm. The airline industry, as we were saying before we came on stage, margins in the airline industry are wafer thin. It's going to be much more expensive for people to travel. And then you combine that with the political climate at the moment. You look at the US, the attack on ESG, the attack on world capitalism. Are customers actually going to pay?
Yeah, I believe they will. We're seeing continued strong demand. I think the one thing I would address, though, if you look at some initiatives like France with this technical ban on short-haul flying, which of course isn't a ban on short-haul flying, it impacts on 3 domestic routes from Orly. You can still fly on the routes that are impacted from Charles de Gaulle, but you can't fly from Orly. But here is where data is very important. Eurocontrol did an excellent study. If you banned all flights in Europe, every single one below 500 kilometres, you would reduce the number of flights by 24%, but the impact on CO2 is only 3.8%. So I think when we're making these decisions, we need to understand, what is the impact of the decision going to be? And we need to be honest with people. If you banned all short-haul flying in Europe, say 3.8%. If you introduced the single European sky in Europe, which is technically possible today, you would reduce emissions by 10%. So there are steps that we can take, and we need every single possible contribution to get to net zero in 2050. But I'm very clear that from an industry point of view, we can do it. And you will be able to continue to fly between now and 2050. And in 2050, this industry will be at net zero. And beyond 2050, I think we can look then at moving towards gross, zero. But, still a long way to go to get to that.
Rachel, did you want to get in on that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I'll just say, one of the things we also are very focused on is equity. And when you look at aviation in terms of a transportation mode, it's probably one of the most inequitable. A very small number of folks creating the bulk of the emissions. And even when you look within the folks that are flying, there's an even smaller number that are either like the business flyers, like probably most of us here, and the frequent flyers. So when you take those costs, do you want to just spread them out evenly across everyone, or the people that are like really the ones causing the emissions? How can we see about getting them to maybe pay a little bit more? These are kind of things that we'll start looking into. Also, how do you give better information to the people that are flying? A lot of people, if they see there's 2 flights and one of them is actually going to be a lot more less carbon intensive than the other, they might select that flight. So we put more also information into the hands of consumers as well.
Just to put some data on that, premium flying, so people who fly in business and first class, 8% of the total flying that's done.
Practically out of time. I've got one very, very quick quick-fire question for everyone on the panel. In 20 years' time, so a lot of people flew in here from New York. I'm going to pick New York to Dublin as case study for this. In 20 years' time, will the energy, the fuel that powers a New York to Dublin flight be electric, hydrogen, SAF, or standard current kerosene aviation?
SAF. Predominantly.
I'm going to have to go with SAF.
Hydrogen.
Of course.
I think you have a combination. You have a battery and SAF. Oh, hydrogen.
But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you for coming. We're out of time. Thank you.
Please welcome Pablo Hernández de Cos, Governor, Bank of Spain, and Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo.
Well, hello, everyone. This session I'm particularly excited about because I am Spanish, too, and we're joined by the Governor of the Bank of Spain, who we've known him for a long time now. Pablo, good morning. Thank you for being with us. Obviously, he's the Governor of the Bank of Spain. He took on that job in 2018. Before that, he was the Chief Economist at the Bank of Spain. Obviously, he knows the House very well, and by extension, the European Central Bank. And he's also chair of the Basel Committee, which is very fitting because we've talked about the banks and how that feeds into monetary policy. So to start off with an easy question for you, the European Central Bank has said that there is no trade-off between financial stability and price stability, the 2% goal. Does that mean that when you meet next week, well, in 2 weeks down in May, you're going to hike rates again?
As usual, Maria, you don't lose time. No? You go directly to the important question. No, thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to Bloomberg for the invitation. So let me try to summarize where we are in terms of monetary policy and also in this connection with financial stability concerns, that you were emphasizing in your question, Maria. Perhaps it's important to understand the context on which we had our last meeting, the meeting that we had in Frankfurt in March. You may remember that this took place in the context of the financial tensions related to the banking sector in Switzerland and also in the US. And we knew that at that time these tensions had already increased investor risk aversion. Also, they have created significant financial market volatility, and they had also led to a drop in bank share prices. So I think it was natural for us to try to emphasize as a key message, I would say even that the main message from our meeting is that we wanted to send this message that we still are closely monitoring the financial tensions created by these events, and of course that we stand ready to respond as and when necessary to maintain price and financial stability. And I guess that you shouldn't be surprised by this, because I always like to emphasize the content of our monetary policy strategy review, the one that was approved by the Governing Council of the ECB in July 2021, on which we emphasize is in the text that you can find in the web page of the European Central Bank, that financial stability should be seen as a prerequisite for price stability. No? Because so that is a very important point to be taken into account. So then, more related to your question, Maria, what about future monetary policy actions? No? What can be expected from us for our May meeting? Again, something that we need to stress is that the financial tensions that I just referred to, that broke out before our meeting in March, imply an additional element of uncertainty around the scenario, the growth and inflation scenario that was prepared by the staff, and these projections were prepared before these tensions took place. So this extra uncertainty made us to stress even more the data-dependent approach that we've been following since almost the start of our tightening cycle back in December 2021. This basically means that our monetary policy will depend on how the numerous and the different sources of risk, including, of course, those related to financial market developments in the last weeks, materialize. So, in other words, and this is something that I think even Philip Lane, our chief economist, was stressing this morning. If, and this is a conditional statement, if the baseline scenario in the March projections is confirmed, we will still have ground to cover to make sure that inflation pressures are stamped out. And in this regard, as you perfectly know, these projections are subject, as I was saying, to various sources of uncertainty, and this is why we are emphasizing this, that the rate path is data dependent, and this means basically that we are neither committed to raise further nor that we are finished with hiking rates. And in particular, in the projections, again, were produced before the banking turmoil. It's true that so far the implications of this turmoil have been relatively contained. However, should they persist, or of course, if they aggravate, those tensions could lead to a sharper than expected tightening of credit conditions, and they could, of course, also erode confidence, and in the end, they could give rise to a scenario of more moderate economic growth and more rapidly declining inflation. So all in all, basically what we have to do in our May meeting is to analyze all the data in terms of the implications for the inflation outlook, the developments of underlying inflation, the strengthening and the strength of our monetary policy transmission, and then decide what the best is to do.
Right, and just to set the scene, because this is crucial not just for your country, but it's crucial to any country that has the euro. And we've seen that this year there has been very aggressive tightening from the European Central Bank. It's the fastest on record. The question for a lot of people is whether you get to this May meeting and you hike 25 basis points or essentially 50 basis points. What I understand from you, and again, this is very significant for every euro economy, and the banks too, and just the everyday lives of people that obviously make projections based on interest rates. What you're saying is that the data that will come up in the next 2 weeks, that will be key for how much you hike. So if I understand it correctly, you yourself, you don't have an idea yet in your mind as to how much you think is appropriate. Until you see that data in the next 2 weeks, that's both GDP and inflation, you haven't made up your mind.
So it's not so much about only exclusively to the information that is going to be published in the next 2 weeks. It is also that we have to take into account all the information that have been released since the cutoff date of the projections. The cutoff date of the projections, of the staff projections in March, was the end of February. So we have already accumulated a good number of surveys, even of hard data. Inflation, even today, was all the segregated information for the euro area was published. New information is still as pending, as you said, Maria. So we have to analyze this in a coherent way, compare all this information with the macro projections that were published in March, and then see to what extent the baseline scenario, including the assumptions on interest rates that were behind that baseline scenario, still prevail, and therefore decide what to do in terms of rates. And till now, I think the only relevant thing to mention and to stress is this sentence that if the baseline scenario, the one in March, prevails in May, this means that further hike will be needed. And then how many hikes, the magnitude of these hikes will depend on this assessment.
And can I ask you, I know maybe you're not going to give me a decision, and you've said you haven't made up your mind, so obviously you're not going to reveal what you're going to do in 2 weeks' time. But if you see some stress in these surveys to hike again interest rates by half a point, so 50 basis points, is there a danger that maybe you're doing too much in a time of uncertainty? Excuse me.
Well,
is that too aggressive?
This is exactly what we have to do. I mean, this is a risk for sure. There is also the opposite risk, no? That I mean, there is always for the central bank, there is always the risk to be to try too strong or the opposite, no? And of course, what we want to be is accurate and to be exactly in the middle. And I would try still to pursue that objective.
And how do you see the inflation perspectives? Because by now, I mean, it's obvious that it's way above the target of the European Central Bank. your entire reputation as a central bank is being able to hit the 2%. If you're not able to do that, well, the question of your reputation and your ability to do it gets into question. That's terrible for a central bank. People see it in their everyday lives. The prices have continued to go up. Core inflation now seems sticky. Where do you see things going when it comes to inflation? Again, there's two measures here. The headline without the volatile components and then the core one. Do you fear separation, by the way, between the two of them? Because that would make it even more difficult for you.
No. This is a very important point, Maria. I think I see both of them as complementary, not as a substitute. No? So it is clear we've already emphasized that our future decisions will depend on our assessment of the inflation outlook, and this assessment will be informed primarily by our staff macroeconomic projections, on which all this new data I was referring before will be incorporated in a coherent manner. But of course, as we said also in our last meeting, a second input, and it's another input, an additional input, will be derived from the assessment of the dynamics of underlying inflation, and this will serve as a complementary cross-check of our forecast. So let me try to put you one example of an illustration of how I see things right now. No? So our baseline scenario, for example, of macro projections in March is one on which we are projecting gradual convergence of inflation to our 2% target. Okay, and there are a good number of reasons why this is the case. This downward trend is underpinned by the gradual disappearance of outward pressures from the reopening of the economy, from previous supply shocks, from the euro area. The depreciation, this will also be reinforced by increasing pass-through of the recent fall in energy prices, and also the exchange rate the appreciation that has happened in the last months. The fall, of course, in inflation in the medium term will also incorporate the moderation in domestic demand pressures, which reflect, of course, also the effects of our monetary policy decisions, including on the euro exchange rate. In parallel, it's true that we have this central scenario on which we see this downward trend on headline inflation, but the reality is that in parallel we have seen that underlying inflation pressure, at least if you measure the underlying inflation pressures with core inflation, the one that excludes energy and food prices, but has remained on the rise and has kept us surprising on the upside. No? And the number today, 5.7% in March 2023, is of course a good example of this. So how I see things, no? Well, when you analyze core inflation, it's very important also to enter into the details on the disaggregated data that is behind core inflation. And there are like two main forces. No? On the one hand, first driver of core inflation are the indirect effects from past commodity price increases, which have been much larger than expected. And given the lags that we estimate for this pass-through to happen, we still see this effect as significant in 2023. But of course, on the other hand, at some point, the fall in energy prices, the improvement in supply chains, the demand that is, of course, moderating due to tighter financial conditions should begin to gradually produce reverse effects on inflation. No? So I like to say that we are in a kind of or a sort of crossroad, no? Where the lag effects of the past increases in commodity prices and exchange rate depreciation are still present, but diminishing, while the first effects of the most recent decreases and appreciation may be emerging and on the rise. No? And of course, one of the big questions, and of course this we need to monitor, is to what extent this second effect will be symmetric, no? As compared to the one that we've been observing that has led core inflation to the upside. These are some elements that we will have to monitor and analyze. Of course, then of course is the possibility, the probability of second round effects in terms of wages and markups is absolutely crucial. What's happening with the anchoring of inflation expectations there, the information that have been released in the last week have been good in terms of, for example, of the survey of inflation expectations by consumers, the one that is published by the ECB, and of course also fiscal policy will be very important. No? We know that fiscal policy has played a very important role in diminishing inflation in the last quarters, but at the same time, we also know when these fiscal measures will be withdrawn, they will create and provoke and cause the opposite effect on inflation. Of course, there is a lot of uncertainty on the magnitude and also on the timing of this effect. So this is why it's so important to be data dependent. So we have to look not only to both indicators, headline and core, but also to the factors that are behind both indicators in order to understand what's going on and try to predict how inflation will be projected in the medium run.
And you mentioned the data. I wonder also, again, looking at this from the perspective of the central bank, but also your role as a chair of the Basel Committee, is there anything that makes you worry when it comes to the European banks? I mean, you referred to the turbulence that we saw in the financial sector, but this was a Swiss bank. The other one was an American bank. They were not really European regulated banks. But have you seen anything that makes you feel this chapter is not over yet? And we saw that panic in markets can move very fast.
Yes, well, no, let me, this is a very important question, Maria, and let me stress a few points. Points that, of course, will not be new for anybody in the room, but I think it's important that we stress them once and again. So the assessment that we have at the European Central Bank, at the Bank of Spain, the Eurosystem level, is that the EU banking sector is strong in both capital and liquidity terms. And the fact is that capital is much higher than it was 15 years ago. The liquidity position also of the European banks is robust. If you look, for example, at the LCR ratio, it is at the end of last year was above 160%, meaning clearly above the minimum requirements. It was even above the pre-pandemic levels, with a large part of these liquidity buffers in cash and deposits with the central banks. Very important, you were also mentioning it explicitly, Maria, this has been the result of the regulatory reform agreed internationally over the last decade. That, as you were stressing, in the case of Europe, these reforms have been applied to all banks, irrespective of their size. So this is the first point I wanted to state. Second point that I think is also very relevant is the fact that given the business model of our banks, the one that is prevalent in the Eurosystem, in the European Union, the fact is that so far our banks have been benefiting from the ongoing tightening of our monetary policy. And this is basically because the interest rate pass-through on the asset side still has been significantly exceeding the pass-through on the liability side. And the reality is that as a result, aggregate banking sector profitability has increased to its highest level. 2022 was at its highest level since 2014. But let me also emphasize a third point that I think is important, the role in this case of banking supervision. Even before the recent developments, recent events, certain supervisory priorities had been set within the SSM, the single supervisory mechanism, specifically to try to mitigate and anticipate the adverse effects of the current macro environment. And in particular, the supervisory focus was placed on banks' interest rate risk and also in the sustainability of their funding plans. So therefore, I mean, in some cases they were even some banks were asked to be more conservative in their interest rate assumptions. They were asked to even modify their model calibration and also validation. So these are all, of course, these three elements are very important. They are very positive. We have to take them into account. At the same time, as usual, I also want to be realistic and to be prudent. The reality is that, of course, there are several factors that will continue to weigh on the outlook for banks. The deceleration in growth is one of them. Combined also with higher interest rates in the end, will create also adverse impact on asset quality and also lending volumes. They will also increase the funding cost of banks, with potential pressure, of course, also on interest margins. And very important, the impact of these factors is expected to become more pronounced over time. Okay, so the first effect of the interest rate hikes for our banks is positive, but once these interest rate hikes will lead to lower demand and also higher cost of funding of banks, of course, the impact will be less positive. And this is why, in the particular case of the Spanish bank, but I think we can also generalize to the Euro area banking system or to the European Union banking system, we are asking our banks to be very prudent in terms of provisioning or in terms also of capital planning, with the idea to preserve or even increase the current levels of resilience. No? And this is, this combination of just stressing some positive elements that differentiate our banking system as compared to those that have been suffering the turmoils of the recent weeks, but at the same time to stress that there are several factors that continue to weigh on the outlook for our banks, I think is probably the balanced way to see things at this.
And sir, just a final question, because we're running out of time, but I have to ask you this question. Obviously, at the European Central Bank, every decision has to get taken by the inputs of every central bank. Sometimes as a majority, not fully consensus, not fully unanimous. We have seen that in the past meetings, there has been large majorities, but not consensus. Do you expect that this is going to be the dynamic going forward as decisions become more difficult? That yes, you get to majorities, but not consensus full-on decisions? Or actually you can get a consensus in the main decision where everyone agrees on whatever you do?
I think, of course, I cannot anticipate what my colleagues will think and will say and will vote for. No, but I tend to think that it is my experience of the last 5 years that in very difficult moments we've always reached a very broad consensus. So my anticipation, my expectation would be for this to last in the following quarters.
Well, we'll find out soon enough. Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us here today. We were hoping to see you in person, but maybe next time we'll manage to make it through. I know you have been very busy, so we appreciate your time and obviously all your inputs today, and we'll see you very soon in Frankfurt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Welcome Frank Ryan, Chairman of the Board, IDA Ireland.
Distinguished attendees, fellow speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bloomberg's first ever New Economy Gateway conference in Europe, and it's an honour to address you. For more than 40 years, my work has yielded for me the opportunity to work with people in business across 5 continents. No matter where I've travelled, I've encountered amongst people a deep commonality of values and purpose. Everybody wishes to live in peace. Every parent wishes to have the opportunity to provide for their family. Every parent wishes to obtain a better education for their children than they themselves were able to access. When people feel that they can meet their heartfelt goals, they are at peace. Some years ago, I had the pleasure of visiting the naval docks in Philadelphia and to observe the USS Forrestal in dock. James Forrestal was of Irish descent and was the first Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. It was Forrestal who said, and I quote, "The only way in which a durable peace can be created is by worldwide restoration of economic activity and international trade." Unquote. That sentiment was true then, and it is true today. Forrestal's words resonate with me. But we must also read the graffiti under the bridges, listen to the small children to find the light bulb moments. Creative solutions come from everywhere. Mature, moral decision-making and thinking encompasses the ability to take and always hold the perspectives of others, to balance the situation against one's own objectives. We must do our best thinking on our most challenging days. The best thinking is the thinking that has the best outcomes for the most people. In the absence of a world trade agreement, many countries have turned to concluding bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements in order to advance trade objectives. These trade objectives and agreements are very welcome. and represent a meaningful way forward. They are important building blocks to what can be achieved in world trade. The World Trade Organization is the only global international organization dealing with trade rules. I commend the member countries of the WTO and the WTO staff in advancing the work of the organization and on the pivotal progress made since its establishment. We have, however, now reached an inflection point as to the future effectiveness of the WTO. Every person, every organisation, and every institution goes through life stages. The external context continually evolves. Reorientation and recalibration are always necessary to continue the journey. Reflection can yield great learning. There is now an opportunity to re-explore the values and beliefs that led to the founding of the WTO. Revisit the progress in world trade achieved to date and what this progress has taught us. Rehear the views and aspirations of member countries. It is my fervent wish that all member states of the WTO would again coalesce to envision the future role of the World Trade Organization, which can serve the peoples of the world to best effect. Empower the WTO with a new mandate to develop and administer a new rules-based system for world trade. Envelop sustainability and climate change as key elements of future WTO policy formulation. We are all familiar with the expression, the customer is king, and we all greatly value customer feedback. We must now view the world as our customer, and climate change represents the strongest of customer feedback. With eyes wide open, I support a resetting of the mission and mandate of the WTO. In doing so, I am deeply conscious of the many current challenges to world trade, the complexity of finding a collective way forward. But this is a journey we must take. The challenges, the problems, are the calls for help from the world and are the learning opportunities of our time. The member countries of the WTO have always shown great resilience in seeking to find a way forward. Enabling this new area of world trade will require cathedral thinking, cathedral ideas. The WTO can be a cathedral organisation. It can be enabled by its member countries to advance sustainable world trade to the lasting benefit of future generations. When relationships veer off course, you must always strive to find a new pathway so that you can create the new mutually beneficial alliances. Now we must dig deep. Now we must find the courage to travel the hard road. At the core of future progress will be empathy, the openness to understand the perspectives of others, the willingness to build the relationships of the future. We must find the new ways to embrace that which unites us. There's a proverb in the Irish language I'm fond of. Isfaran kaint the haganas and tiakon. In English, talk that brings peace is best. Talk that brings peace is best. We must now put in place the building blocks for world trade in the 21st century. We must build well, for upon this foundation may rest peace and the well-being of mankind. For we are one world. Thank you for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you for joining us on day one of the inaugural Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Europe. I ask for just one more minute of your time. It's almost 4 p.m. At 4 p.m., the next breakout session, Reglobalization, Risks and Rewards, begins in the Lara Room. And if you're not going to that, there are a couple of other attractive options for you. You can explore the exceptional grounds here at Powers Court with a walk around the gardens, or you can head proverbially across the street for a 90-minute golf outing. There's a scramble start. I think it's at 4:30. You can register for both of those activities up in the lobby. And if you want to do something else, just ask the check-in desk. There are many other options available to you this afternoon. After that, I look forward to seeing you back here at 6 p.m. There'll be a cocktail hour heading up to our gala dinner, where we will be treated to a meal by the celebrated Irish chef Gráinne O'Keeffe. And you'll hear Paschal Donoghue, the Irish Minister for Public Expenditure. He might be the most popular, possibly the most popular man in the country. He'll have $16 billion of fiscal surplus euros. 16 billion euros of fiscal surplus to spend next year. He also happens to be the president of the Eurogroup, and he will be interviewed by our very own Reto Grigori. So with that, I'll let you go, and I'll see you back here at 6.